I'm glad it's appropriate that this follows a video on Standing Rock, because there's a direct link between Standing Rock and the war in Syria. It was the war in Iraq, that made the DAPL pipeline possible and profitable, and the war in Syria is meant to keep it so. It's 25 years since the so-called Cold War came to an end with the destruction of the USSR and the socialist republics of East Europe and Mongolia. Let's go to the timer here. In the quarter century since what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the USSR, the U.S. has sanctioned, invaded, or bombed at least a dozen countries. It has destroyed or laid waste to Iraq, Yugoslavia, and Libya. It has invaded Afghanistan and Somalia. It armed and paid for the 2006 Israeli invasion of South Lebanon and 4 bloody wars against the people of Gaza, all part of the ongoing 70-year U.S. proxy war against the people of Palestine. U.S.-trained Saudi pilots flying U.S.-made planes are raining U.S.-made bombs and missiles on the people of Yemen, who have been reduced to starvation by a U.S.-backed naval blockade. The only difference between a U.S. airstrike and a Saudi or Israeli one is the colors painted on the wings of the F-16s, or the F-18s, which they have now. Washington has expanded NATO while paying neo-Nazi mercenaries, well, they're actually not all that neo, to wage war against the people of Donbass and East Ukraine. In the past 25 years, at least 2 to 3 million people have died from U.S.-made bombs, missiles, artillery, economic sanctions, and drone strikes from Pakistan to Somalia. In 2007, General Wesley Clark told Democracy Now! Of a Pentagon memo that was released shortly after 9/11 that said, as he put it, "We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." They have not taken out Syria. In Syria, it is not mission accomplished, as George Bush proclaimed after the U.S. captured Baghdad in 2003. In Syria, the largest CIA Pentagon covert operation since the war against Afghanistan in the 1980s has met a major military defeat. That's right. I wish Comandante Fidel Castro, who always stood by Syria, could have lived to see this day, but the Cuban people see it, and Syria has thanked Cuba for its support. Today, the 2-star flag of the Syrian Arab Republic flies again over the heart of Syria's largest city, Aleppo. Over West Aleppo, where tens of thousands of people have been held prisoner, hostage for 4 years, used as human shields by a combination of terrorist outfits armed and paid for by Washington and the U.S. agent regimes of Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Jordan, NATO, Turkey, and of course the racist entity that occupies the land of Palestine. That's right. The people of West Aleppo were starving, not because of the Syrian army, but because the terrorist invaders were seizing and speculating on the price of food. And Syria's flag still flies over East Aleppo, which never surrendered, but where 200,000 people lived under terrorist siege for 4 years, often without food, water, electricity, living under a constant rain of mortars, rockets, and improvised so-called hell cannons launched by terrorist forces, their plight completely ignored in the Western media. It has been nearly 6 horrible years since Syria was invaded by what became an army of mercenaries and terrorists from 80 countries, trained and directed by the CIA and Green Berets, paid for by U.S. tax dollars and Saudi and Gulf state petrodollars. The invaders included armed forces from the Gulf states, from Jordan and Turkey. The Saudi royal treasury has long been a slush fund for the U.S. deep state. The Saudis paid for Reagan's covert war against Nicaragua in the 1980s when Congress refused to fund it, as well as the bulk of the cost for the CIA's war against Afghanistan. I'll come back to that. Maybe 500,000 Syrians have died in what was once a stable country that provided its people with free health care and college education. How many more have lost limbs or eyes, or sanity, have been widowed or orphaned. Nearly 10 million people have been driven from their homes. 3 million have fled the country, most to neighboring countries, but the majority are displaced inside Syria. The media don't tell you that the majority of Syrian refugees fled to state-controlled areas of Syria. They don't tell you that in the 2014 elections, in those countries where refugees were allowed to vote, like in neighboring Lebanon, most refugees voted for President Assad.
That's right.
The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is basically a guy in London quoted endlessly by the professional liars of the media monopolies, admits that most of the dead are people who supported the government. Soldiers and militia, government workers, they would kill postal workers routinely, members of religious minorities, Alawi, Christian, Yazidi, targeted by the sectarian terrorists, or just people who did something they didn't like. Many died in horrible ways, beheaded, burned alive, or hacked to death. And it's not over. There are still terrorist and mercenary forces elsewhere in Syria. The U.S. state apparatus and its regional agents are still scheming. The House just passed a bill authorizing man-pads, portable rocket launchers, anti-aircraft missiles to be sent to terrorist forces in Syria, and the Senate will probably approve it next week. Taryn sent me something just before the meeting. I haven't read it yet, but it's concerning a waiver on the amount of weapons that can be sent to the Syrian terrorists by the U.S. government on the type of weapons, because before they were afraid they would fall into the wrong hands. Israel has responded to the victory in Halab, Israel, by launching missiles at Syrian bases near Damascus. Israel Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman admitted it, and the so-called Revolutionary Command Council of the so-called Syrian rebels thanked Israel for the bombing, for the missile attacks.
Says it all. Yeah.
The victory in Halab first belongs to the people of Syria and the Syrian Arab army and militia, tens of thousands of whom have given their lives to defend their homeland. Had the Syrian government and army not enjoyed the support of the majority of Syrians, they could never the government could never have withstood the onslaught against it. The victory also belongs to the Lebanese resistance led by Hezbollah, which handed Israel its first major military defeat in 2006. They stood with Syria because Syria and Iran stood with them in 2006, providing a safe haven and a lifeline, and they know that if Syria falls, they will have to face the U.S. armed Israeli state and Lebanese fascist forces without a line of support. It was after the victory in 2006 when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and the Shia fighters of Hezbollah were seen as heroes across the Arab and Islamic world by both Shia and Sunni and Christians. It was then, when they had so much popularity, it was then that the royal tyrants who rule Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Emirates, and Jordan, the servants of Wall Street and the Pentagon who prop up their masters with hundreds of billions of dollars in annual tribute, began, in concert with the State Department, with Robert McFarlane and Elliot Abrams and Robert Ford, to prattle about the Shia menace and the Shia crescent, which somehow included Syria, which is a majority Sunni country. It was then under the Bush regime that the concrete plan to destroy Syria took form. It was conjured under the Bush regime and implemented under Obama, just as the Bay of Pigs was planned under Eisenhower and implemented under Kennedy. Governments change, the state remains. That's a very important point. The victory in Halab could not have happened without the solidarity of Iran, which has been in Washington's gun sight since the 1979 revolution. Since the 1979 revolution that overthrew the Shah and deprived Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank of its biggest depositor and the U.S. military-industrial complex of its biggest overseas customer. Saudi Arabia has stepped in obediently to fill both roles. And it could not have happened without the solidarity of Russia. Russia intervened in Syria at the request of the elected Syrian government. It was an act of self-defense. Russia had no choice. The Putin administration does not want confrontation with the U.S. in Syria or anywhere else. But it knows that after the 7 countries cited by Wesley Clark, Russia is number 8 on the list. Right. The Pentagon still views Russia, post-Soviet Russia, as an enemy to be destroyed. Had Russia not acted in time, the U.S. would have invaded massively and directly, most likely on the pretext of fighting ISIS. The U.S. Air Force, under the pretext of bombing ISIS, has destroyed Syrian infrastructure while missing the columns of ISIS trucks carrying stolen Syrian oil across the border to Turkey under the protection of Turkey's NATO military. Its ultimate destination is likely Israel. And they've missed columns of ISIS columns advancing across open desert in daylight. On September 17th, the U.S. Air Force, allegedly fighting ISIS, bombed the Syrian army at Deir ez-Zor, murdering 83 soldiers. That happened on the anniversary of the 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre a few miles away in Beirut, where thousands of Palestinians were murdered by fascist militias working with Israel. It also happened the day before the second Clinton-Trump debate, and neither candidate mentioned it. It was done by the Pentagon without consulting civilian authority, which says a lot about power relations in Washington. And I'll remind comrades to check out, Sam wrote about this years ago in the pamphlet Generals Over the White House, which is always worth reading. And this has only grown more so since then. That it's the military and the deep state and the Pentagon that run things, and the civilian authority is just a rubber stamp. Yesterday, President Obama told CNN that U.S. intelligence was surprised by the sudden rise of ISIS.
Oh my goodness.
Bullshit. For my language, let's be clear. ISIS or Daesh is not some blowback, some unintended consequence of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was deliberately created. It is an international COINTELPRO operation. The roots of ISIS lie in a Saudi-Jordanian intelligence operation coordinated with the CIA and Pentagon to undercut the Iraqi resistance to the U.S. by turning it into a sectarian war. And this also benefited Saudi Arabia by taking their unemployed and disenfranchised and angry youth, sending them on a so-called jihad in Iraq, where their main targets were blowing up Shia mosques like at Karbala, and creating a sectarian war where before there was a potential for unified resistance. ISIS emerged to prominence in 2014 at a very convenient time. The Maliki government had just ordered U.S. troops to leave Iraq, and President Obama had just backed down from bombing Syria in response to an attempt to frame the Syrian Arab Army for a phony manufactured chemical weapons attack in the Damascus suburb of East Ghouta. ISIS was created as a more attractive enemy. No doubt the Pentagon generals hoped that ISIS could defeat the Syrian army, maybe even take Damascus, start massacring people, and the U.S. could come in as a savior. It didn't happen, thanks to the heroism of the Syrian Arab Army and its Lebanese, Iranian, and Russian allies. And by the way, most Syrian Arab Army soldiers are Sunni Muslims. Trump and Flynn know this. If Trump doesn't know this, his military advisor, who is formerly the Defense Intelligence Agency, Larry Flynn, surely does. When they speaking of making the fight against ISIS a U.S. priority, they're spinning the same myth that the State Department and Clinton and Obama and John Kerry are spinning. Behind much of this is the hand of Saudi Arabia. But the Saudi kingdom is not an independent actor. Saudi Arabia is the United States. Saudi Arabia is the United States. It has no independent operational capacity. Its mercenary military, mostly made up of mercenaries from South Asia and Southeast Asia, is run by U.S. contractors, Northrop Grumman in particular. Its banking system, the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, is run by J.P. Morgan Chase. Its supposedly national oil company, Aramco, which once stood for Arabian American Oil Company, is quote, managed by a consortium of the big four oil giants, ExxonMobil, Chevron Texaco, British Petroleum, which is half U.S. owned, by the way, and Royal Dutch Shell. The Saudis are Washington's agents in OPEC. The U.S. tells the kingdom, the Saudi family and the other royal families of the Arabian Gulf, what to charge for their oil and where to put the money. And they put it on Wall Street or spend it on massive arms purchases from the U.S. military-industrial complex. This money, this petrodollars, is tribute, protection, paid by the royal families of the Gulf to the U.S. ruling class. To keep this money pouring in, to keep the Arabian Gulf as a cash cow has been the prime objective of every war and covert op the U.S. has carried out in the region since 1945. which included, by the way, the first overseas operation of the CIA, which was to overthrow the Syrian government in 1949. And that includes the creation of the racist state of Israel, which U.S. generals have called our unsinkable aircraft carrier on stolen Palestinian land. Israel is a loaded gun aimed at the people of the region. Israel's wars in the 60s and 70s destroyed the economies of Egypt and Syria, tipping the balance of power in the Arab world in the favor of the pro-U.S. monarchies against the nationalist forces. Had it not been for Israel, it's likely the Saudis would have lost their throne decades ago. The U.S.-Saudi relationship, and Shah of Iran was part of it at the time, allowed Nixon and Kissinger to take the dollar off the gold standard when the U.S. economy was overwhelmed by the costs of the Vietnam War. The fact that oil is denominated in dollars and those dollars end up in the United States was crucial to the U.S. ability to sustain the Cold War and still to maintain a giant military apparatus at the expense of the rest of the world. I don't know if people understand how this works, but basically, the dollar is not backed by anything other than the U.S. military force, and since 1973. Right. And the role of the Saudis and the Shah before that was critical in keeping the dollar at the center of the world economy. What is Washington's objective in Syria? What is the object of all this chaos and destruction? The object is chaos and destruction. I actually never like the term regime change or hegemony because I don't think it does justice to what's really going on, which is a constant battle. The capitalist class is in a constant battle against crisis, against that crisis that is unique to the capitalist system, the crisis of overproduction, which Karl Marx and Engels wrote, a crisis that in an earlier epoch would have been deemed an absurdity, where the economy goes into crisis because too much has been produced, except now, in the era of the merger of finance and industrial capital, it's not just the overproduction of commodities, it's the overaccumulation of capital, and the need to preserve the value of capital. And how does capital escape from these crises? Karl Marx wrote way back in 1848, before the imperialist era, by the conquest of new markets, the more intense exploitation of existing markets, and the enforced destruction of a mass of the means of production. George Bush is a liar and a fool. But when he spoke the words "mission accomplished" from the deck of the USS Kitty Hawk after the invasion of Iraq, he was neither lying nor being foolish. He was speaking the absolute truth from the point of view of his class, the bankers and billionaires, the monopoly ruling class of this country. For them, the invasion of Iraq was a gold mine. It was a bonanza. The destruction of Iraq's national oil industry gave the oil majors their most profitable years ever. It drove the price of oil from $30 a barrel to $147 a barrel in 4 years. Company values, value of companies like Exxon on the market quadrupled because huge assets that were considered non-performing because it would take a certain amount of money to extract the oil suddenly became performing assets that could be listed on the books. And it opened huge markets for capital investment, not in Iraq, but in former Soviet Central Asia, in the Canadian tar sands, in shale and oil gas around the U.S. and around the world. It made the fracking boom of the last decade possible, which would not have been possible if the price of oil was not much higher, was not higher than it was, and it also made it profitable for Noble Oil to drill for gas off the coast of occupied Palestine. Trump's campaign manager, George Papadopoulos, was involved with that. And Virginia Oil, in which Rupert Murdoch and Dick Cheney were invested to drill in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. And it also, most important, it rescued the oil industry and the U.S. capitalist class from the oil glut that followed the collapse of the USSR, particularly in 1998, where a ruble crisis drove the price of oil below $10 a barrel. But it had two downsides for U.S. imperialism as well. One is that the high price of oil allowed Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Ecuador, other oil-producing countries to be more independent of the United States. It allowed Venezuela to help Cuba, for example. And also, the other downside is that capitalists do what capitalists always do. They produce more than the market can bear. The wild forces of overproduction overwhelmed the attempts to control it. And the U.S. ruling class, the military, the Pentagon tried to stave that off by bombing Libya, by sanctioning Iraq and Iran, by starting the war in Syria, which, among other things, prevents what is a nightmare for the U.S. oil companies, which would be a pipeline from Iran, a joint Syrian-Iranian oil pipeline bringing oil to the Mediterranean. But finally in 2008, 2009, really the third quarter of 2008, there was an economic slowdown. The price of oil began to fall. One response by the United States was to provoke the situation, was a coup in Ukraine, and to try to create a crisis in Ukraine to try to block Russian oil and gas, especially gas, from coming to Europe. But none of this really worked. And what happens in times of economic contraction, the ruling class begins to fight among themselves. And for example, and the Obama administration embarked on a different strategy than war. They made a deal with Saudi Arabia to let's try and run with the falling price of oil and try and wreck the economies of Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Ecuador. People in Nigeria now are on the verge of starvation because of the falling price of oil. And it also pushes up the dollar. But for those on the lower tiers of the capitalist class, and they're still fabulously wealthy, those who are this strategy worked to the benefit of the oil majors because ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, they have a lock on Saudi Arabia. Bloomberg said 2 years ago that Exxon could be the big winner in the oil crash because they have enough reserves to last it out and can buy up the failing properties of quote, poorer, less wealthy, less billionaires, not trillionaire oil producers. But for those who are invested primarily in domestic fracking, guys like Harold Hamm of Continental Resources and Kelsey Warren of Energy Transfer, the guys who are behind the APL pipeline, for the Duncan family, folks like that, they're being badly hurt. They're taking a loss, and they want an end. They are against the Iran deal. They also have no love for Saudi Arabia because they're locked out there. And these are some of the big financiers of Trump's campaign. And in a way, it's like the same section of the ruling class that financed Goldwater in 1964. The Western oil billionaires who are the second-tier capitalists who are more reactionary because they can afford to give less in terms of concessions. Sorry, I'm beginning to get a bit complicated here, but I mean, there are always fights in the ruling class, and especially around election time, because you got a multi-trillion-dollar government budget with big contracts and appointments and tax loopholes at stake. But it's usually at the lower levels of the ruling class, and really the issue is usually who gets what. For example, during the U.S. war against Iraq, the Democrats were constantly complaining about Cheney and his relationship with Halliburton and Halley making money off the Iraq war. They didn't talk about the ExxonMobil and the really big guys and the banks that control them. But anyway, that's something on the basis of the fight that's going on now about Trump's allegedly difference with the Obama administration on the war against Syria. But the Trump regime cannot cancel the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. They cannot cancel capitalist overproduction. They are driven to war just as much. The same forces operate on them as operated on the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the previous Bush administration, going back to William McKinley in 1898, forces of imperialism. The bottom line is this: the needs of monopoly capital are in conflict with the need and the right of poor and oppressed countries to develop their productive resources. Right. That's really the essence of what this war is about. And we are on the side of the oppressed, whatever their leadership. We say U.S. hands off Syria, out of the Middle East, out of East Europe, and a victory for oppressed people everywhere is a victory for the working class and oppressed people here. Mission is actually never accomplished because the system is obsolete. It only can preserve itself by force and violence. It's running from crisis to crisis. All they can do is stave off crisis, and the only way they have to do that is war. When the Soviet Union was overthrown and the Yeltsin regime came to power, hey, that was regime change. You couldn't have had a more lackey regime than Boris Yeltsin. The pro-capitalist forces who overthrew the Soviet Union, they dreamed of a new Marshall Plan. After all, when Germany was defeated in Italy in World War II, mostly by the Soviet Union, of course, the U.S. poured in aid, this Marshall Plan. But the only reason they did that was because they were in a global confrontation with the forces of socialism and liberation, and they needed to prop up West Europe for that reason. They had no reason to prop up a post-Soviet capitalist regime in Russia. They didn't pour money in. In fact, they expanded NATO. They continued to expand NATO into the former Soviet Union. They waged war in Yugoslavia. U.S. capital and Western capital went into Russia and the former USSR and just bought plants and shut them down. There was because basically, Yeltsin and his cronies thought, if they restored capitalism, they would become guests at the dinner table with the big imperialists. They were guests at the table, but Russia was the main course. The world capitalist market has no room for any more. Has no room for a capitalist Russia. It has no room for the Commonwealth of the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the Brazil, the BRICS countries, the Shanghai Economic Cooperation Organization. The world capitalist market is saturated, and all they can do, all that the imperialists can do, is destroy. I think, and in fact, these are the forces propelling. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism. Capitalism is monopoly stage. Monopoly is about restricting supply, crushing, stamping out any competition. And they are headed for a bigger war. They do need a bigger war, and they have no choice. The same forces that propelled the imperialist powers into World War I against one another after they had brutally carved up Africa and Asia and the Caribbean and the Pacific, the same forces that propelled them into World War II are at work today. But and as far as the Arab world, the oil, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, price is going from $30 a barrel to $147 a barrel. The profits were astronomical. But it was short-lived. It's like a vampire that feasts on blood. The next day it has to drink again. I do think that, Halab, it's an open question. It is a turning point. It is, in a sense, like Stalingrad. But the imperialists are not sleeping. The U.S. ruling class, the Pentagon, the CIA, they have to keep going because they have no choice. One thing that has allowed Russia to assume a more independent position vis-a-vis the U.S. and Europe than it had under Yeltsin, and basically that is also allowing Iran, a number of countries, to act more independently, and even the Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, is the growing strength of China, which includes this Chinese state sector. That's really the engine, the economic engine of resistance to the United States in the world today. And it seems like Trump, some of those allied with him and the ruling class are those who want to cut to the chase and focus on China as the main enemy. But, whatever factions were behind Trump when he ran for office, now he's in office, he's got to represent everybody, the biggest banks, the biggest capitalists. But the important thing to understand is the economic laws that are propelling them towards war. The law of monopoly is there can be only one. There is this, see, one of the reasons that we don't encounter too much in our milieu is the idea that Trump is some kind of peace candidate. That idea is out there, is widespread because he has spoken out again. He has spoken for better relations with Russia. But, there is nothing. We've had a lot of peace candidates. Woodrow Wilson was reelected in 1916, 100 years ago, on the platform of keeping us out of World War I. 2 months later, he went to Congress for a declaration of war. Johnson was the peace candidate against Goldwater. Goldwater said, if we don't vote for stop Goldwater, we'll be bombing North Vietnam. Johnson started bombing North Vietnam. In '68, Nixon came in with a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. And of course, that was massive carpet bombing, mining Haiphong Harbor, invading Cambodia and Laos. I compared Trump to Goldwater. Trump actually, the 1964 Goldwater campaign, which was crushed by the bourgeoisie, he took the five southern states plus his home state of Arizona. He was running on a platform of what was called repealing, people described as repealing the 20th century. And he was called an isolationist. He said, I don't want to send U.S. American boys to do what Asian boys should be doing for themselves. Sounds very, What we need to use is low-yield nuclear weapons. And he was backed by the same sector of the ruling class that is behind Trump. The Western oil billionaires and so on. But the domestic oil sector was the biggest factor. But at that time, two things were different. The economy was in much better shape in the U.S. There were plenty of industrial jobs. Unions were more than 20% of the workforce was unionized. And the U.S. was confronting a global challenge by the movement of the oppressed. When Fidel Castro came to Harlem and people were lining the streets, this terrified the U.S. ruling class. And they were, the liberation struggle was raging in Africa, and the black struggle here, the Latino struggle here. They said, we've got to make some concessions. And that didn't sit well with the sectors of the ruling class that were behind Goldwater, the southern textile, bosses, the lumber barons in the South, and the lower strata of the ruling class. Today, those jobs are gone. The Soviet Union has been destroyed. There is no global challenge to imperialism on a political basis. And they say, and in a way, the Trump victory is kind of bringing 25 years after the fall of the USSR, it's kind of bringing dispensing with the Cold War architecture, which includes not just concessions at home, but when they talk about international entanglements, isolationism doesn't mean anti-imperialism. It means go it alone. We don't need to be held back by Europe and all that. We don't need these alliances. We can bomb who we want to when we want to. Now, there's a slip between cup and lip, because there's a lot of different factions involved, and Trump can't do everything that he wants to do. But imperialism is the capitalist system, the imperialist system, and imperialism is a system. And economics is spiraling deeper and deeper into crisis. There's no way out of that. It's contracting, and its contraction is driven by the rapid growth of the productive forces that where the huge leap in the productivity of labor, which should mean abundance and the end of hunger and worldwide prosperity. But capitalism, the capitalist system, needs scarcity. It depends on scarcity, and that's what really what war is. Why they need war. They need to destroy, and that's also why we have no choice but to build a people's movement to stop them, because the survival of humanity ultimately depends on it.